Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Clara Bocchino, and with Lisa Blanken, we are the coordinators for this webinar series for the SADC Transfrontier Conservation Areas Network and Steering Committee. I'd like to welcome you all to this week's deep learning on funding new and established TFCAs. The moderators for this week are Doreen Robinson, working at UNEP as a Global Chief of Wildlife, and Kule Chitepo, Chief of Partnership for the Resilient Water Programs of USAID and Tomonex International. Doreen and Kule, the floor is yours. Thank you all for joining. Don't forget to put your details in the comment box and enjoy this week's deep learning session. Thank you.
Great, I think I'm unmuted. Welcome everyone to this session. We're looking forward to a really dynamic session. And it looks like we've got 54 participants, and I see some old friends in there. So looking forward to great discussions. Just a few ground rules to get us started. Because we want this to be a dialogue and we expect lots of participation from the audience, we are asking, however, that you raise your hand or put it in the chat box. And we will be able to unmute folks if they want to speak. But we're asking you to make short and pithy interventions, 2 to 3 minutes, so that we can make as much space for as many people to share their perspectives. And as soon as you hear something that you would like to talk about, please feel free to start chatting away in the box. But before, just to get everybody started on this conversation, I want to introduce our discussants, our expert panelists, and then Kule and I are going to tag team on trying to keep the conversation flowing and lively. We'll see how that works, Kule. So let me start by introducing the panelists. The first we have here is Werner Mayber. Many of you know he is the CEO of Peace Park Foundation, and he's had many roles in that organization over the years. Werner has been involved in over 500 different development projects within TFCAs, and he also serves on various other boards and in different roles, ranging from the board of the Southern African Wildlife College to being on steering committees for various parks in Mozambique. So welcome, Werner. Our next panelist is Dr. Nyambe Nyambe, who is the Executive Director of the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. In his 20 years working in conservation, he's worked for IUCN on wetlands and on community issues. He's worked for the Center for Environment and Development in KwaZulu-Natal, Namibian Nature Foundation, and also World Wildlife Fund. And then last, we have Patience Gandiwa, who is the Executive Technical Advisor on TFCAs and conventions at Zim Parks. Patience is a natural scientist with extensive experience, research experience in Ganaraju, and she also has over 30 peer-reviewed papers and has worked on protected area management all over Zimbabwe, and she's worked for African Wildlife Foundation. So that is those are our expert panelists, but I can tell from the growing audience now at 58 that we have lots of experts in there. So please get ready to engage. But we'll get the things started by asking an initial round of questions of each of our panelists. So the first questions I think I'll give to Patience. Patience, transfrontier conservation areas and financing. That's what we're talking about and doing a deep dive on today. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that you think governments have in attracting funding and investment for these TFCAs? And you have to unmute. One day we're all going to learn this.
Thank you, Doreen. Can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. Well, financing arrangements for TFCAs remain an important part of TFCA development. As most of you might already be aware that the establishment and development of individual TFCAs remains the responsibility largely of governments to take leadership in that process. And they have, governments do have the authority and collective responsibility for protecting and managing natural resources across their international boundaries. Hence, they should play an important role in attracting funding arrangements for such development initiatives as TFCA. And there are a number of ways that the governments can do that. And these are some of the issues that, that the activities that they are already doing. Normally, you might be aware that someone is willing to come to your party if you are also attending, or when you're, and they are likely to do so when you are absent, so, or committed elsewhere. So government willingness to budget for the TFCAs at national level shows the significance that they place on the initiative. And even when lobbying for additional financial and technical support from ICPs or international cooperating partners and the private sector, usually such partners want to know the value that the government or support and co-financing is like. And such commitment is also demonstrated through setting up even TFCA units, appointing warm bodies to spearhead and catalyze the development of the TFCAs, and also supporting even attendance of government officials to meetings, etc. Because of the complexity and multiplicity of land use systems that are in these TFCAs. I think it's very important that governments also take a leading role in planning for this area, land use planning, and just that willingness to collaborate and to work with diverse stakeholders. I think it's very important, because most government institutions are responsible for these land areas within TFCAs. They are the planning authorities, and even funding partners are usually more interested in supporting initiatives when there is actually clear plans and willingness for governments to plan for the area, including going beyond the boundaries of the protected areas, and also even communal lands. The other role that the government can also play is also just making sure that there is a ease of doing business and willingness to work with different stakeholders. As you are aware that TFCA development is about partnerships, it's about collaboration, it's about building supportive networks. So the government, if it expresses more willingness to do that, I think even more funding would follow. And the other issue also is managing politics. As you are aware, of course, there's politics everywhere, but I think if it's not managed well, sometimes it can also affect a number of things. Even TFCA development initiatives can be affected if the governments are not handling politics, or even working with wider stakeholder network, even working with other governments is concerned. So Great. That's actually something very, very important. So there are a number of initiatives or roles that governments can play, but I think this budgeting, planning, and ensuring ease of doing business, I think they are more important.
Great, thank you, Patience, for that. And so that you've laid out actually a lot of roles that the governments need to play to create the right enabling environment to attract investment, as well as providing investment. So I'm going to turn next to Dr. Nyambe. And in addition to government, what are the other institutional arrangements that are necessary to be able to secure investment for TFCAs? And also, what do TFCAs need to do to be able to show that they can manage risks?
Thank you, Doreen, and thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon. I think I'll just pick it up from where Patience left it, and this is on the point of ensuring collaboration, coordination, understanding. So we're talking about institutional arrangements, really. It's anything and everything that needs to be done to ensure collaboration amongst the partner states and stakeholders to attract funding and technical support for the establishment and development of any TFCA. And these institutional arrangements would basically range from a composite of legal powers, administrative structures, and even financial provisions, which would give rise to a definable system of governance and decision making. So we're essentially talking about calling attention to the following, among others. For example, a treaty that outlines the broad framework of cooperation, including the legal, administrative, financial, and general governance procedures and requirements. The necessity to have a secretariat that serves as a hub for communication, coordination, and facilitation of all the partner states' work, including bringing to the table of critical coalition and strategic partners. And the nitty-gritties around basics such as the rules of procedures on stakeholder, on conducting meetings, and also how to engage partners that are working or willing to come to the table in supporting the development of NTFCA. It's very important to also pay particular attention to the roles of the different stakeholders, including communities. Now, the reason why we need these institutional arrangements really is about coordination and ensuring that everything is done according to the requirements, and also ensuring predictability. Now, not having these institutional arrangements that are elaborate and clear for everybody poses a lot of risks. And the number one risk is that of failing to attain internal integration amongst the partner states themselves that need to come to the table and work together. The other one is that of failing to attain a required level of external adaptation, how to work with the supporting organizations. So you can only have this internal integration and external adaptation if you have institutional arrangements that enable the different partners to come to the table, to resolve any issues of dispute, to implement the agreed programs of action, to undertake financial commitments, and also basically create an enabling governance framework that supports the technical staff from the different partner organizations and from the partner states, and importantly also how those technical officers bring into the picture the different partners that have to work with the partner organizations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I think you've touched on a lot of the processes about how to ensure coordination, but I think these issues of transparency and having clear processes also go a long way towards building donor confidence, which is a critical part of attracting investment. So I'm going to turn next to Werner. My question for you is, given your experience with over 500 development projects and TFCAs, what has been your experience in the roles in supporting sustainability of TFCAs? And what are the roles of an organization such as yourself in supporting that? Oh, you're muted, but hold on, I'm going to unmute you. I think I can do that. I think I have that power. There you go.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, I tried to unmute, sorry. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for the opportunity. During in the case of Peace Parks Foundation, and we've been on this journey literally from the beginning, and it's over 20 years now. For me, there were 4 critical success factors that really stood out that enabled increased financial support into TFCAs. The first one by far, I think, was this incredible element of ownership by governments, and the formalization of TFCAs. Now, you must remember, nowhere else in the world has this program become as formalized as in Southern Africa. You have peace parks all over the world, and Waterton Glacier, for example, once a year they will shake hands. But here, we took it to a level of, very good structured formal relationships, which was underpinned by government-to-government agreements. And because of that, it enabled a lot of large development agencies, international cooperating partners to come to the table. It was such a strongly endorsed government program. It's at scale. It touches a broad range of aspects. It's a holistic in its approach. It looks at biodiversity. It looks at socioeconomic development. It looks at regional peace and stability. So I think that combination of looking at the landscape at a holistic level is a very important factor that drives successes. And that's also why you'll see KfW and the World Bank and the European Union, all of these large development parties say, hold on, this ticks a lot of boxes for us. Another very important component, secondly for me, that unlocked a lot of resources was not only the top-down, but also the bottom-up planning processes. You know, Dr. Nyame is on the call. If you look at CASA went about of doing this extensive consultative process, and the results was these integrated development plans. And not only did it ensure ownership at a broad stakeholder level, it also meant consultation at the ground and really getting alignment with communities as well. And that process unlocked quite a lot of opportunities in terms of clarity of where one can invest and what are credible bankable projects with a strong level of ownership. So I think that was a very important part of this process, the planning, the integrated development planning aligned with national development strategy in the country. And then the third one that really started to unlock a lot more funding, and I'll give you an example in the Peace Parks context, was the development at the park level. So the TFCA got a lot of different components, and the cores, if you like, the glue will be the protected areas. And the moment one started to invest or develop credible business plans to say, if you invest in this specific protected area, it will unlock significant funding. It really took the investment of donor support and investor support to another level. So for example, in the case of Peace Parks, we mobilized about R1 billion in the first 10 years of existence. And in the second 10 years of existence, we mobilized over 5 billion rand. Now that's billion, not million. And so in today's equivalent, probably $400 million in the second 10 years decade of our existence. And the majority of that went to park development, park implementation within TFCAs, so that your building blocks eventually lead to your development of the larger TFCA. And then the fourth one just simply was credibility, credible plans, credible implementation partners, strong level of ownership, and strong elements of partnerships between multitude of different organizations. So I would say those are all the ingredients that led up to helping to unlock significant financial resources for the TFCA concept.
Great. Thank you so much. So I am going to turn it over to my co-moderator, who's looking very serious. But I put a note, if you want to speak, we want this to be a dialogue. So please, if you want to speak or intervene, either raise your hand or you can type it in the chat box. We've got another round of questions lined up, but after that, we are going to be turning to you all. So please get ready. Otherwise, we may have to call you out. Okay, Kule. Oh, I'm unmuting you. Hold on. Apparently, I have all the power. Ask to unmute. Or Clara, if you are secretly behind there with some power, there you go.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for the power. And good afternoon, colleagues. So that was great from all three of our panelists. Very informative. Thank you very much. I thought what would be useful now is just to maybe get into a bit of the weeds in terms of what has worked well. We want to look at now what has really worked well, and perhaps also what has not worked that well and perhaps could have been done differently. What are some of the things that could have been done differently? The idea here is to get us towards, we're all facing a new reality in many ways in terms of conservation, not least with the current epidemic. And we want to look at what have we learned from some of the experiences we've all had, and what kind of thoughts would be helpful in us charting a new way forward for financing of TFCAs. So I'll go back to you, Professor Patience, and perhaps you can share some thoughts about, from the government perspective, from supporting TFCAs as a government institution, what are some of the things that perhaps have worked well or not so well? page.
Unmute.
Prof. Kandiwa.
There you go.
Hello?
We can
Okay.
hear you.
Now we can hear you.
Thank you for that question, Kule. As you are aware, and many colleagues that I see have joined us around the table, very, very good. We have seen the evolution of the TFCA concept and more acceptance of TFCAs as a both a conservation and also a development tool. The fact that the SADC region has a network currently of 18 TFCAs at different stages of development, and with 12 of those with formal agreements, I think in terms of formalization and creating the space for investment so that we can be able to achieve the intended objectives that are enshrined in each and every of the agreements for those TFCAs. I think it really, on that part, in terms of formalizing and having even also integrated plans. Of course, it's not every TFCA that has an integrated development plans, but I think several strides have been made with support from various cooperating partners working closely with governments to have the TFCAs have some development planning framework. And also even one other issue which has worked well, which contributes to creating that environment for financing TFCAs is really at SADC level to have that a linkage within the framework of our institutions within SADC, TFCA, to have a TFCA development guidelines and also several other supporting instruments and strategies. I think it all makes this TFCA dream a reality and more clear even to those that might be skeptical that this is a very ambitious initiative. I think one other issue which has worked well is also we are seeing an increasing network of TFCAs, government-to-government collaborations, doing things on the ground, joint patrols, joint planning, and joint cross-border tourism products. I think on that front, I think those things have, or those initiatives have really demonstrated that the TFCA dream is not far-fetched, it's real, and we can actually make a difference on the ground and involve local communities in the TFCA development metrics.
Great, thank you very much for that, Patience. Nyambe, I also would like to ask you, I mean, you mentioned a lot about some of the institutional arrangements that are, required, that are forming the current model in terms of the makeup of TFCAs. You talked about the importance of the Secretariat as a hub, the importance of certain protocols as detailed as rules and procedures, and the stakeholder stuff. But what has really worked is that kind of arrangement and that infrastructure of resources, how has that worked, man? Is that something that we need to look at again as we are, reshaping ourselves and reimagining TFCAs for the future? Maybe some thoughts from your experience of how these institutional arrangements have worked well or perhaps not so well, and thinking also around what could have been done differently. What could be done differently?
Thank you very much, Kule. To begin with, I think if one was to use CAS as an example, the institutional arrangements have played their part, and they're definitely what I want to focus on is really the...
Sorry, Nyambe, you cut off a little bit there. You said they played their part and?
what I would like to focus on is really, you know, the issue of how we can, for example, encourage new and innovative ways of fundraising. I just want to give an example of, you know, the initiative that we saw recently involving 3 NGOs coming together to put in a proposal to one donor. I believe for CASA that was unprecedented, but it managed to bring in substantial resources. And then, of course, we have regional arrangements. The funding that's been coming to CASA up to about 35 million euros now from KfW, via KfW from the German government, that has been negotiated for through the regional platform, through SADC. So we need to look at different ways of fundraising, and also to move away from a very high risk area of focusing on 1 or 2 major donors, because that presents significant risks to the aspirations of the establishment and development of any TFCA. But to the extent possible, we also need to encourage, especially our NGO partners, how they can feed into the IDPs, the integrated development plans, so that they support the already existing planning or programmatic priorities as opposed to reinventing the wheel. And lastly, but not the least, the importance of the opportunity for donors to come together as opposed to working in isolation, but trying to support a similar cause or the same cause for that matter. So really what I'd like to say is that the current institutional arrangements have worked. They just need fine-tuning in areas where we believe there can be improvements. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nyambe. And then finally, Werner, maybe, I mean, you've laid out those nice 4 areas of success, or contributing success factors for financing of TFCAs from PPF's perspective. But perhaps again, just looking at what could have been done differently, or what can we do differently in order to be, you know, to increase our levels of success in terms of mobilizing resources for TFCAs. Werner? You don't have the power. Doreen, can you give Werner some power?
I actually think it's but let's see.
Clara?
No, it might be me.
There we go. Thank you. Okay. So what has not worked well, Guli? I suppose, you know, one of the things, again, just talking from a Peace Box perspective, one could probably have, from the outset, given more emphasis, you know, although there's this TFCA process, country-to-country process, what we've seen and in practical reality is, if there's no parity between the different countries or the different protected areas, if they're not at the same level, it's very difficult to transition from you know, let's say a TFCA philosophy to a TFCA in practice. Extremely difficult, because there's simply no capacity to operate at the same level. For example, let's say you want to have a joint tourism opportunity or development. And if the product on the one side of the border is inferior to the product on the other side of the border, or if the road infrastructure on the one side of the border is inferior to the other one. So whenever there's that inequality or lack of parity, I think it really slows down. A practical example, for example, let's say Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park, and you have Kruger Park, 110-year history, and then there's the fledgling Limpopo National Park. And so all the plans we had for cross-border law enforcement stayed at plans. It didn't really transition to the next level of operationalization. But the moment Limpopo Park then upped their capacity to really start looking at, you know, a a very well-structured, well-financed law enforcement park management system. The moment that happened, spontaneously the two countries started working together. And then you had monthly meetings of the rangers saying, okay, how do we work together? What can we do things? So I think probably the one thing that I would have done probably a little bit differently in hindsight, which is always 2020, is even a lot more focus and attention on getting each country's house in order, if you like, in order to sooner and quicker get to the real reason why we want transfrontier conservation areas functioning in terms of ecology, climate change mitigation, species diversity, robustness of the ecosystems. Bigger is better. All of the benefits that we know is important why we are advocating development of TFCAs. So that will probably be my only comment that I would say. I would have loved to focus much more on that parity and bringing the countries to the same. It's happening now, but probably one could have started sooner.
Wonderful. Thanks, Werner. A lot of rich information there that's been shared by colleagues. Doreen, over to you. I hope you've also been tracking some of the questions in the chat box. I've been trying to.
Yeah, so Werner, I'm going to flag for you. There's a specific question for you in the chat box, so I may come back to you, or you can choose to answer it in the chat. But I see a hand raised, so I'm gonna unmute Pete Teran, who has a intervention. I think I'm unmuting him. There we go. Pete, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Doreen. Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone again. Been a while. Now, just two comments, brief comments. So the one, just on the governance institutional arrangement side, what we're trying now in the Great Limpopo, or what we've done is we've established what we call a partnership forum. And the idea is basically to create a platform where we're fortunate enough to have a rich diversity and really good partners that's been with us for a while. So we're trying to create a platform where partners can sit together and coordinate and exchange information better between themselves and also between us from a GLTFCA perspective. The second, my second point, and I'll be interested to see what our panelists think about it. I think from a TFCA perspective, and I think Werner sort of alluded to it, I think we need to get more organized on the landscape level. And I think we need to basically look at the parks and the relationship between the parks and the areas outside the parks and how to set up these landscapes better from a stakeholder perspective. Because I think once you do that, then you get more investment from a government perspective. So you get more in buy-in from the different ministries and departments from government. And then you also can unblock these big investments like Werner was referring to, where you get a massive donor or private investment in these protected areas. So I do think we need to focus more on getting the landscapes more organized.
Thanks for that. I think the other value, look, we're all in competition for limited funding, and that's the reality. But the value of taking that broader landscape approach and what TFCAs offer also takes you into a rural development space that conservation groups don't often know how to tap into that funding. And so it creates an opportunity, that landscape approach, right, to look at different ways and different donors and different models of funding. So does any of the panelists want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, Doreen, if I can,
yeah.
Is my mute off? I think, yeah. Landscape level development really can unlock significant resources from other sources. For example, if you look at carbon financing and the RED mechanism, it doesn't really support protected area development.
Exactly.
But recently, we've been quite involved with a company called Biocarbon Partners in Zambia, and facilitated and brokered the investment from a large oil and gas company to finance a massive RED project, the largest one in Africa now, 1 million hectares. But what's significant there, and it's a 20-year offtake program in the landscape between the monopools TFCA and the lower and the South Luangwa, Malawi Zambia TFCA, is that 170,000 people benefit directly in this landscape from this initiative, and the communities are the custodians and owners of the resources and protect the forest themselves. So I think there are mechanisms like this that happened. This deal was signed earlier this year in February. It's over $100 million that goes into the landscape to the communities, and I think that's probably what opportunities lies ahead in terms of unlocking funding. And then we also shouldn't forget about impact investment opportunities. That's probably easier to mobilize and unlock in the areas outside of a park. A park, let's face it, takes a long time to capitalize and a long time to actually make money, and then they don't make a lot. But outside, there's a lot of opportunities that will attract private money, which I think is probably one of the things that we collectively should do, is try and attract far more investor money and far more private money into the landscape, which is probably easier than into the protected area system as investments.
Thank you. And for the panelists, if you want to jump in, give me some sort of body movement so I know. Otherwise, I do want to, there's been a couple of comments in the chat that have focused on how do you get the core funding for M&E activities. We know M&E activities and being able to document and show results is critical for that investor confidence and keeping the resources flowing. But I wonder if any of the panelists want to respond on experiences and how to do that in a reasonable way, as someone said, without hijacking the whole budget, because we could monitor a whole lot in these big areas. Maybe Nyambe?
Thank you, Doreen. I really missed that question. Which question, by who?
Just in general experience on, there's two questions about how to attract the level of funding needed for the basic monitoring and evaluation operations, which are necessary, right, to keep the funding going. But what's been the experience, for example, in Casa TFCA on that?
Okay, no, thank you very much for that question. I think attracting funding, and from experience, and funding for M&E tends to be quite difficult. But if it is built into the program itself, it can work. So for CASA, we've been working with a network of partners to develop what is called the CASA Impact Monitoring System, which is available on our website. It's an evolving tool, but basically what we've been doing is we had seed funding under KFW support to set up that system, and we are still working with our partners. I think one challenge that arises is the need or the failure to continuously update the M&E tool, and also being able to actually extract and communicate the outputs from that tool so that we can demonstrate the impact. So I think it is something that, from what we've done so far, it can work. We've established a CASA Impact working group, and that is a group of experts that are helping us with these monitoring processes. And it's too early to demonstrate and claim major successes, but the basic foundation has been laid. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm also, if anyone wants to speak, because this ability of me to multitask and read and look for hands, it does get challenged. So please do raise your hands if you want to actually speak and make your comment or give another intervention. Other than that, though, one of the things I want to turn to is, we're living in a COVID world. And in a COVID world, the top thing on folks' minds, including donors, including our most reliable biodiversity donors, frankly, is not TFCAs. And so what can we do? How do we package TFCAs and what they offer differently to make sure that we attract the kind of sustainability of funding that we're going to need in this world? Any ideas from anyone in the audience or the panel on how do we innovate and deal with that situation? Raise your hands if you'd like to speak. Otherwise, I'm going to ask someone on the panel to respond, or even my co-moderator. Patience, do you want to say anything? Or Kule?
Okay. Okay, thanks very much, Doreen. I wanted to make a comment on the attracting funding for M&E. I wanted to say, well, it goes back to planning and the project design. It's not very difficult to find funding for M&E, especially when that has already been incorporated in the project design. And it's not easy to find specific funding to do just a M&E when there's been no inclusivity at project design and planning level, because I've seen that there are some partners or institutions that are more receptive to committing budgetary resources when they have been involved in the planning or strategic planning processes. They wouldn't want to be involved in something that they're not so sure, or even the targets or the outcomes of that, or even the variables that should be considered in the first place in designing a project. Because when you defining what is it that you want to monitor, or what is the evaluation criteria that is acceptable within the framework of such a project, I think that is what makes it more meaningful, or makes it more attractive, other than just wanting to do it for the sake of ticking the box, or just wanting to get it done. And then in terms of the second question that you asked on the COVID, I think there is no time ever in the history of TFCA development that partnerships have not been very important. I think this is a great opportunity to maybe lobby for more social and even government acceptance of TFCAs as development tools and initiatives that can assist governments and everyone interested in seeing the sustainable development goals and the various other visions that are shared at various levels. Thanks.
Thanks, Patience. One thing I'm gonna pull out of the chat here too, and maybe answer my own question a little bit, is two concepts have been raised. One's ecosystem services and how to tap into that payment for ecosystem services. But the other, and it's something I spend a lot of time on in the UN world, is the role of these large, intact, connected landscapes in preventing future pandemics. And the science is there, and I think TFCAs have something very unique there, that that offers something not just protecting piece by piece, but protecting the whole. So I think that's another avenue that could be explored. I'm going to ask. I'm not sure if I can unmute. I think I'm going to unmute you there, Lisa, because you want to speak. I think I've unmuted you.
Yeah, thanks. As a co-host, I somehow cannot raise my hand. Thanks a lot, Doreen. Maybe also following up on the comment that Patience just made on how important building partnerships is. I think there are also some of the funds that are quite untapped, such as JEF and GCF for TFCAs. And I think especially JEF, it's often country allocations, although they very much welcome cross-border proposals. So sort of how do we see the potential of TFCAs also tapping into these funds and countries working together on joint proposals, maybe not for an entire TFCA like CASA, but then maybe for one WDA, between two countries to start with. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll let the panel, but I'll also so Nyame is going to answer, but also we have some donors in our audience here. So I encourage you to raise your hands and contribute too. So Nyame?
Oh, thank you. Lisa, that is a very valid question, and in the context of CASA, I think the lack of agility in terms of the partner states to really work together and seize the opportunities that come with global environment facility allocations, I think has been a challenge. If you look at the current programming, for example, it speaks to community-based natural resources management, tourism, enterprise development, wildlife dispersal areas, and it has not happened for CASA. I believe that should have been, that was a low-hanging fruit. So I think we really need to build agility, but there are also other opportunities that we need to look out for in terms of the GEF windows, for example, the international waters window. We're talking about the Zambezi River Basin and the challenges that the Okavango River as a shared water course and the Zambezi River and as a shared water course, the challenges that they face can actually be addressed within that window. But like I said, I think we've not moved with the relevant speed, and in part, maybe with a lot of hindsight, this is a result of the fact that by the time the opportunities came to the knowledge of CASA, the partner states had advanced so far in deciding on the national priorities outside the CASA landscape, or indeed any other TFCA. So I think it's a question of how we can improve in our communication and programming so that we can move together. Thank you.
So I'm gonna turn it over to Kule in a second, but I see a comment. I'm gonna unmute Pamelo to raise his point about the private sector and possible creative ways to attract funding for TFCAs. So you have the floor if you would like to speak. Or you don't. There you go, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding the local companies that are operating within the CASA region and the multinational corporations, which also have interest in development of some of some countries or some of the areas that are have been designated as TFCAs. To say, how do we entice them to have that interest in participating in financing biodiversity protection and other things, especially when you look at what we have within the CASA region and other TFCAs. We know that companies come in, international corporations come in. Some we have them in Botswana, but for instance, allow me to say, for instance, if we take a corporation like DBS, how do we make DBS to have an interest in CASA TFCA where Botswana is, and to what extent can we repackage? Somebody talked about packaging ourselves accordingly, and that is something that one can ask himself or herself on how best we can go about this thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Kulal.
Thank you. That was a good question. Does anyone from the panel want to tackle that question from Pamela?
I think the question was speaking directly to CASA, so if I may. Yeah,
sure,
first, Pamela, yeah, it's an important question that speaks to the need for strategic marketing and communications in the first instance. And the second instance is the need for us to identify shared risks with the private sector, be it local or international. There has to be a reason for them to understand that there is a risk to which they need to respond for them to invest in a particular TFCA. So if it's a company that is, for example, interested in using the water resources of CASA, we need to have a compelling reason for them to appreciate that down the road, several years down the line, they may be out of business because we've failed to protect the catchments upstream. That is outside the corporate social responsibility arena, which is, I think, something that you normally do with strategic and marketing communications. But what I'm talking about is getting the private sector to invest, like Werner was talking about in the area of RED, and carbon markets, because a company feels that if the levels of deforestation continue and they are working in the forest sector, they may be out of business. So we really need to continuously engage the private sector, and the need for private sector engagement strategies is compellingly urgent, in particular for CASA. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyambe. I had a point to make. You know, Werner, you talked about one of the success factors being the investment in the protected area as being the core of the TFCA. And I remember also various conversations with patients referring also to the protected area needing to be supported in many ways, and having financial investment because it forms the core of the TFCA. And this brings me to a question that's been raised by Biganyi in the chat box, talking also about competition with other developmental priorities for TFCA related funds. So my question to you, Werner, and maybe you can answer it in the context of general competition, is do you find that when you're trying to raise money is there competition between TFCA kind of transboundary landscape risk fundraising and kind of, you know, the core protected area investment fundraising for core protected areas? Do you find that kind of tension or competition with certain interests being more for one or the other? Werner, maybe you need Doreen, sorry.
Thank you. Doreen, you've got too much power in this conversation.
Crazy.
I haven't experienced a competition for resources within and outside protected areas now. I think it's different donors, different objectives. I think your large development partners are very much about poverty relief and large scale, more focused on the large scale level development. What we've seen in protected areas is that, and outside, for me, the most important thing is to have a credible business plan. And you will unlock money from donors if you've got a credible case to say, if you put in your money, it won't be wasted. There's a light in the tunnel. We work towards a clear plan of sustainability. And I think the same outside of protected areas. If there's a credible case, whether it's an investment in a solar farm or a fishing project or agriculture, whatever the case is, again, for me, the unlocking of the money is more about de-risking it for the investors, the ease of doing business, and if you have those elements and you've got a clear case to say, you know, if you put in money here, you've got a good chance of making money, because that's what the private sector is about, isn't it? It's about making money. But sometimes what I'm quite interested in recently, and Peace Parks, and we're actually appointing a chief investment officer now, is blended financing mechanisms. So how can we incentivize private sector to take the risk, but have your risk being guaranteed at minimum or at principle by your donor community? So that blended finance, I think, is something that has not really been explored extensively. There's this Rhino Impact Bond. That's the first attempt to really create a bond, which is basically essentially an outcomes-based payment system. And I think it's something that the Legacy Landscapes Fund that's now been recently established between KfW and AFD also is looking at, is to say, well, if you from the private sector puts in 5 million, we'll match it with a further 10. And so through that, you de-risk a little bit the private sector's investment. So for me, that's the low-hanging fruit here, is the mechanisms where we blend public and private money to unlock more money into the region and take the risk profile a little bit down for the private sector. And I think that's probably something that will come through more and more and more in the future.
Thank you. And we are now fast approaching the end of the hour. Time flies so much when you're having fun. But maybe I could just ask each of our panelists, starting with you, Patience, just to give the 1 minute kind of summary of your last kind of reflections and thoughts, and then hand over to my co-moderator and we can close. Patience, do you have any last thoughts? Doreen, the power?
No, that's not me. There she goes.
There you go, Doreen. You've got some power to unmute me. Okay, just a few reflection points is that whilst it's the prerogative of governments to spearhead the establishment and development of TFCAs, I think there's need for more appreciation and flexibility that the civic society and private sector can also play a more important role in providing incentives for investment in these TFCAs as a special economic zone so that we can up our resource mobilization efforts, as well as alignment of the TFCA development or planning framework with the national development strategies and other even global frameworks within several environmental conventions that most of these partner countries involved in TFCAs are already party to, as well as within the formative stages of these TFCAs, especially the emerging TFCAs, to ensure that we incorporated maybe financing mechanism strategy, which also involves the non-conventional options like biodiversity offsets to get the points from the one from the floor, Pamela, the role of companies like, you know, those large multinational mining companies, you know, so that we can think outside the box and be more innovative when it comes to financing these TFCAs, doing business unusual and expect more players to take part in the TFCA process. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Patience. And Holly, you made a comment about baselines, but we don't have time to ask you to elaborate verbally, but maybe you can elaborate what you meant by the baselines in the chat. I think it was a good point you were making there, Holly. And Dr. Nyambe, and then Werner, and then we can wrap up.
Thank you, Kole. Mine is just a reflection on institutional arrangements, and to just make the point that in my talk, I emphasize the structural aspects of institutional arrangements, the tangible ones, which we can see. There is the intangible side of things, like the culture of the organizations and the countries. We really need to invest more time in understanding those elements because they equally can have far-reaching impacts and implications. So it's one thing to focus on the rules of the game, which is what we normally see in the form of the structured arrangements, but also the rules in use, the unspoken things. We really need to interrogate, and the role of the partner states, secretariats, and experts in deciphering those elements is very critical. Thank you.
Thank you. And Werner, last few words.
Yeah, no, well, I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity. I think I've said my bit. I like what Doreen said. Doreen said about you know, large landscapes and how, you know, intact connected landscapes is incredibly important for the future of the global health and of everything to sustain our planet. And it's a hook definitely for TFCAs that we could definitely do something more about, like COVID is now shown us clearly that we should do. You know, I think the future is bright then if we just manage to look after these incredibly valuable landscapes and do everything in a way that is innovative and through partnerships and with governments and with private sector and with other NGOs and donors, of course, as much as possible. There's a really bright future for TFCAs in Africa and the world.
Thank you so much, Werner. And Doreen, over to you to take us to the end, the finish line.
Yeah, I think we've gone over the finish line by 2 minutes, but you know, we started a lot talking about collaboration, cooperation, institutional arrangements, transparency, roles and responsibilities. But then we went into a space where conservation doesn't always go, right? We talked about de-risking and shared risk management and blended finance. There's been notes about tax incentives. I was going to put a note in. I've done some creative stuff with equity loans and loan guarantees. These are spaces where conservation doesn't always go. But if we're really going to make TFCA sustainable, these are the spaces we have to move into. So it's been a great discussion. I hope everyone's been keeping up with the chat. Sorry we didn't get to everyone, but there are some great thoughts and resources in there. And thank you for the opportunity. Great to see old friends. Thank you, panelists, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kule.
Thanks, Doreen.
For the session today. I just like to remind all of the participants that a lot of the issues that were coming up today are going to be discussed in the seminars and webinars to come, like having multiple designations within TFCAs, like sustainable financing and the role of tourism in a post-COVID world. So keep up with the program and join us every week as you can. If you can't join us, the recordings are already on YouTube as we go. Every week we put them on our YouTube channel, so you can look at it again or look at it for the first time there. Otherwise, register every week for the seminar. Thank you very much to the moderators for your time and to the experts for your time today and your knowledge. Have a wonderful day forward, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye.